If you watch this video right till the end, I'll take you through the major camera settings, visible and seemingly invisible, which will help you to click super sharp images of birds and wildlife with your D500. Why are we talking about a 20.9 megapixel DSLR camera of 2016 in a world of mirrorless cameras with a zillion megapixels? The answer is simple. We want to know if the D500 is relevant for bird and wildlife photography today in 2024. The short answer is yes. Go ahead and get yourself one. Mirrorless cameras are expensive. I know many students and hobbyists who want to try their hand at photography but simply cannot afford mirrorless cameras. And most camera manufacturers have discontinued their line of DSLR cameras. Mirrorless cameras, the top of the line mirrorless cameras cost about 5 lakh rupees, which is about 6,000 US dollars. And the mid-range mirrorless cameras, even though they cost about 2.5 to 3 lakh rupees, which is about $3,000, simply don't focus fast enough for wildlife action. And that's what's keeping cameras like the D500 still relevant even in 2024. But the D500 has been discontinued, so the only way for you to get your hands on one is from the used camera market. You can get a used D500 for somewhere between 40,000 to 60,000 rupees, which is about 500 to 700 US dollars. Let's look at some of the specs of the D500 that are especially useful for bird and wildlife photography. So let's look at the number of autofocus points, the autofocus speed, the frames per second, the buffer size, and the image quality. If you read the specs of the D500, they'll tell you that this camera has 153 focus points and 99 of them are cross-type. Cross-type points focus faster and more accurately than linear focus points, especially in challenging fast action photography and in low light. However, what you must know is that if I have a bird perched on a branch or a bird flying in the sky or any tiger, any animal, any living creature, if the eyes of the creature are even slightly out of focus, then that picture is unusable. The nose, the beak might be in focus or the ear of a tiger might be in focus, but if the eyes are even slightly out of focus, when you look at the picture, you'll think there's something wrong with it. To ensure that the eye of any creature is supremely sharp, we need to set our autofocus area to single point and then maneuver that one single point to the eye of the creature. So that way, the camera locks focus on the eye, and even if there are leaves and branches and twigs in the way, your subject will always be sharp. So when we set the autofocus area to single point, now we no longer have 153 focus points to choose from. We have only 55 focus points, and only 35 of them are cross-type. And unfortunately, the focus points that fall on the rule of thirds are not cross-type points. The camera is able to latch focus pretty quickly, but obviously that also depends on which lens you use. So if you're using a 200 to 500 or a 500 PF or any of the prime lenses, it's going to latch on to focus very quickly. The camera can do 10 frames per second, which is very important when it comes to photographing birds and wildlife. I'm always clicking pictures in the burst mode, and I find that the camera slows down after 4 or 5 seconds. It's taking this time to transfer the images from the camera's buffer onto the memory card, that's onto the SD card. You should not have this problem when you use a fast XQD card. The image quality on the Nikon D500 is pretty special. It can do well at even at 1600 or 3200 ISO. You'll get a good enough picture quality for a double spread magazine print. Images clicked at 6400 are full of digital noise, but present day AI tools make that noise go away completely. So don't be afraid of clicking at higher ISO values if you have to. But simply owning a D500 and setting it in one of the automatic or semi-automatic modes is not going to give you good images. Now let's talk about some of the camera settings on the D500 that will help you to click super sharp pictures of birds and wildlife. Focus point, as I mentioned, I select my focus point manually and adjust it. Make sure that the focus point is overlapping the eye of the creature so that the eye of the creature is always supremely sharp. A very important setting on the D500 and many other Nikon cameras, even the top of the line mirrorless cameras, is focus tracking with lock on. You'll find this in the autofocus menu of your camera. I set this to delayed all the way to the right. What happens here is once I select my focus point, overlap it with the bird, and I lock focus on the eye, the camera is able to hold focus for longer. That way, even if a twig or a leaf or another bird comes in the way, the focus does not shift and I'm able to latch onto that focus longer. So even if the head of the bird momentarily leaves my single focus point, I still have focus there. So the chances are if it's in or around that focus point, I'll still have it in super sharp focus. I set my autofocus mode to autofocus continuous. So what happens when I set it to continuous is as long as I keep the shutter release button half pressed, the camera continues to hunt for focus. So even if the bird comes a little towards me or goes a little further away from me, the camera is always tracking it and will try and keep it in focus for me at all times. Now that we've looked at the camera settings, let's go one step further and understand the different modes on your D500. This will help you to understand why you sometimes get blurry or shaky images when you click pictures in the automatic or semi-automatic mode. In this segment, you may see cameras other than the D500, but remember that these modes are the same on any camera. You might think that the aperture priority mode is an effective mode for wildlife photography. In the aperture priority mode, we set the aperture value and the camera automatically computes the shutter speed based on the ISO. So let's consider this first case where we set the camera to aperture priority, keep the ISO on auto and let the camera figure out the shutter speed on its own. Now, when we are clicking birds in action, remember the camera does not know what we are clicking and what the speed of action is and what is the minimum shutter speed requirement to get super sharp images of that action. Very often you will find your images are not going to be super sharp because the resulting shutter speed is not fast enough to freeze that action. So it's very important for us to know what our shutter speed needs to be, the minimum shutter speed requirement to get sharp pictures of that action. That's why the aperture priority mode is not as effective in most situations, except when the subject is not moving very rapidly. So that brings us to the next mode, shutter priority. In the shutter priority mode, we set the shutter speed and let the camera figure out the aperture. We can look at our subject and the pace of its movement and figure out what the shutter speed needs to be and let the camera figure out the aperture value. So let's take this second case scenario where we set the camera on shutter priority, set the aperture to auto and let the camera figure out the aperture value. Very often, especially in low light, if we set a fast shutter speed and the camera requires a wider aperture which is just not available on the lens, then the pictures will turn out underexposed.
So it's very important for us to have total control over the aperture and the shutter speed. So that brings us to case number 3. Setting the camera in the manual mode, setting the aperture value to the widest and the shutter speed to what we think is needed for that scenario, and set the ISO to auto. This is a very effective way of doing things, more effective than aperture priority and shutter priority, because here we have set both the aperture and shutter speed according to the action that we are clicking and have the ISO on auto. However, very often the exposure isn't super awesome. It's either too bright or too dark. To ensure that we click a perfect exposure in camera, get super sharpness, it is imperative to learn how to use the camera in the manual mode. Once you learn how to click pictures in the manual mode, you will be able to nail a super fine exposure every single time and nail focus exactly where you want it.
I'm Girish Menon and I teach photography through live video calls. You can be based anywhere in the world and still learn photography from me. How cool is that? Please have a look at my website www.girishmenon.com to have a look at the different workshops that I offer.